Every scar told a story, and when he finally understood, his smirk became silence. The conference room at Joint Base Andrews fell into a deadly quiet as Colonel Marcus, Patriot, Harrison stared at the medical file in his hands, his face draining of all color. Across the table sat Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Cross, her scarred hands folded calmly while the man who had spent 20 minutes mocking her obvious inexperience finally understood the truth that would haunt him forever. The burn scars covering her left arm weren't from a kitchen accident. The shrapnel marks across her neck weren't from training mishaps. The surgical scars on her hands weren't from medical school practice. They were from the night she had crawled through a burning helicopter in Helmand Province to drag out 5 dying Rangers, including the young Lieutenant Marcus Harrison, who would have burned alive without her sacrifice. "Sir," Master Sergeant Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible in the shocked silence. "She's the medic who saved your life in Afghanistan. She's Phoenix 6. What Colonel Harrison didn't know was that the woman whose scars he had just ridiculed was the reason he was alive to ridicule them. Before we dive into this incredible story of sacrifice, recognition, and the moment when arrogance was crushed by the weight of truth, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from today. And if you believe that heroes' scars tell stories of courage that words could never convey, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. The classified briefing at Joint Base Andrews had been routine until Colonel Harrison walked into the conference room and saw Lieutenant Commander Sarah Cross for the first time in 8 years. The extensive scarring on her visible skin had immediately drawn his attention, not in recognition of sacrifice, but in dismissive judgment that would soon become the most shameful moment of his military career. Sarah's assignment to the Joint Task Force Planning Committee represented the culmination of a medical career that had been defined by extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. Her specialized expertise in combat trauma care and battlefield medicine had earned her positions on the military's most demanding medical teams, but the scars that marked her body told a story of sacrifice that most people would never fully understand. Her journey to that conference room had begun 12 years earlier as a young Navy medical officer assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's Helmand Province. The assignment was considered one of the most dangerous medical postings in the military, providing trauma care for special operations forces conducting the most hazardous missions in one of the war's most contested regions. The base served as a critical medical hub for American forces operating throughout southeastern Afghanistan, treating everything from routine injuries to catastrophic combat trauma. Medical personnel at Chapman worked under conditions that challenged every aspect of their training, providing life-saving care while under constant threat of enemy attack. Sarah's reputation at FOB Chapman had grown through her willingness to accept medical missions that other personnel considered too dangerous. She volunteered for forward medical support roles that required deploying with combat units into hostile territory, providing trauma care at aid stations that were frequently under direct enemy fire. But her most defining characteristic was her refusal to abandon wounded personnel regardless of tactical conditions. While other medical officers waited for secure extraction, Sarah consistently moved forward under fire to reach casualties who would die without immediate medical intervention. Her medical expertise was exceptional, but her courage under fire was legendary among the special operations forces she supported. Rangers, SEALs, and Special Forces personnel requested Sarah specifically for missions where medical support could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The night that would define both Sarah's career and Colonel Harrison's future had begun as a routine medical evacuation mission in November 2016. A Ranger patrol had been ambushed in the Sanjin district, sustaining multiple casualties who required immediate trauma surgery that could only be provided at the main medical facility. The medical evacuation helicopter carrying Sarah and her trauma team had been struck by enemy fire during the extraction, crashing in hostile territory with wounded Rangers aboard and enemy forces moving toward the crash site. The situation had escalated from medical evacuation to combat rescue in seconds. The helicopter had crashed inverted with the cabin filled with fuel, creating conditions where any spark could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone aboard. The Rangers were unconscious and trapped in wreckage that was beginning to burn, with enemy forces approaching the crash site to eliminate survivors. Sarah's response to the crisis had been immediate and decisive. Despite being injured in the crash herself, she had crawled through burning aviation fuel to reach the trapped Rangers, beginning medical stabilization while the aircraft continued burning around them. The rescue had required multiple trips into the burning helicopter to extract 5 critically wounded Rangers whose injuries made self-extraction impossible. Each trip had exposed Sarah to flames, toxic smoke, and burning fuel that created the scars she would carry for the rest of her life. Her medical treatment of the wounded Rangers had been performed while the helicopter burned, using techniques that saved lives under conditions that should have been fatal for everyone involved. Her trauma care had stabilized injuries that would have killed the Rangers before conventional rescue forces could arrive. But Sarah's sacrifice had extended beyond medical care. When enemy forces reached the crash site before American rescue units, she had provided defensive fire that protected the wounded Rangers while coordinating their evacuation. Her actions had enabled successful rescue of all personnel while preventing their capture or execution. The young Lieutenant Harrison had been among the Rangers whose lives Sarah had saved that night. His injuries had been severe, second- and third-degree burns, shrapnel wounds, and smoke inhalation that would have been fatal without Sarah's immediate medical intervention under impossible conditions. Sarah's treatment of Harrison had included emergency surgical procedures performed in a burning helicopter while under enemy fire. Her medical expertise had stabilized injuries that conventional trauma protocols couldn't address, using innovative techniques developed through necessity and desperation. The rescue operation had succeeded in extracting all personnel, but Sarah's injuries from repeated exposure to burning fuel had been severe and permanent. The burns, shrapnel wounds, and smoke inhalation had required months of surgery and rehabilitation that left her with scarring that would never fully fade. Her actions that night had earned her the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, and recognition as one of the most courageous medical officers in military history. But more importantly, her sacrifice had enabled 5 Rangers to return home to their families instead of dying in a burning helicopter in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Harrison's recovery had taken over a year, during which he had no memory of the crash or the medical officer who had saved his life. His injuries had been so severe that he had no recollection of Sarah's sacrifice, and his medical records had been classified to protect operational security. Harrison's promotion through the ranks had been rapid, his leadership abilities and tactical expertise earning him recognition as one of the Army's most promising officers. His assignment to Joint Task Force Planning represented his selection for positions that could lead to general officer rank. But his success had been built on a foundation he had forgotten. The night when a Navy medical officer had risked everything to ensure he would live to achieve the career that was now flourishing. His dismissive attitude towards Sarah's scars reflected ignorance of the sacrifice that had made his life possible. The briefing that had brought them together was routine strategic planning for medical support operations in emerging conflict zones. Sarah's expertise in forward medical support made her essential for planning that would determine how American forces would provide trauma care in future operations. Colonel Harrison's initial reaction to Sarah's presence had been professional but dismissive. Her visible scarring had created assumptions about her experience and capabilities that reflected ignorance rather than understanding of what those scars represented. "Lieutenant Commander," Harrison had said with barely concealed condescension, "I hope your medical experience includes more than what appears to be primarily training accidents. We need officers with actual operational experience for this planning committee." His comment had been overheard by several officers in the briefing room, creating an atmosphere of uncomfortable tension as Sarah maintained professional composure despite the obvious insult to her service record and sacrifice. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had served multiple deployments and recognized the significance of Sarah's scarring, had attempted to provide context that might prevent Harrison's ignorant comments from escalating. "Sir," Rodriguez had said carefully, "Lieutenant Commander Cross has extensive operational experience in forward medical support roles. Her background includes some of the most demanding assignments in recent military history." But Harrison's response had revealed the depth of his ignorance about the woman whose sacrifice had enabled his career. "Sergeant, medical support roles don't typically result in that level of obvious injury unless someone wasn't following proper safety protocols. We need officers who understand operational realities." The moment that would transform the briefing from routine planning to life-changing revelation had occurred when Rodriguez decided that Harrison's ignorance needed to be addressed directly and immediately. "Colonel Harrison," Rodriguez had said with growing intensity, "would you be willing to review Lieutenant Commander Cross's service record before making additional comments about her operational experience?" Rodriguez's request had been supported by the production of classified medical files and operational records that documented Sarah's service history. The files contained details of missions and commendations that told the story of extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. Harrison's review of Sarah's service record had begun with routine professional interest that quickly transformed into growing recognition and horror as he understood the implications of what he was reading. The medical file documented Sarah's injuries from the helicopter crash in Helmand Province, burns covering 30% of her body, shrapnel wounds from enemy fire, and smoke inhalation that had required emergency surgery. But more importantly, it documented the circumstances that had caused those injuries. The operational report described Sarah's actions during the medical evacuation helicopter crash, detailing her repeated entries into the burning aircraft to extract wounded personnel while under enemy fire. The report documented her medical treatment of critically injured Rangers while the aircraft continued burning around them. But the detail that had stopped Harrison's breathing was the list of personnel whose lives Sarah had saved that night. The first name on the list was 2nd Lieutenant Marcus Harrison, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, with injuries that would have been fatal without immediate medical intervention by the aircraft's medical officer. The recognition that had followed was immediate and devastating. Harrison's memory of the crash had been suppressed by trauma and medication, but the medical documentation revealed that he owed his life to the woman whose scars he had just mocked as evidence of incompetence. His understanding of Sarah's sacrifice had continued to deepen as he read operational reports that detailed her actions under conditions that should have killed everyone involved. Her courage had been so extraordinary that military historians had classified her actions among the most heroic medical rescues in combat history. The room had fallen into complete silence as Harrison processed the reality that his entire career had been made possible by the sacrifice of the woman he had just insulted. Every promotion, every commendation, every achievement in his military service existed because Sarah had risked everything to save his life. Harrison's response to the revelation had been immediate and profound. His professional composure had crumbled as he understood the magnitude of his ignorance and the debt he owed to someone whose courage he had just questioned. "Lieutenant Commander Cross," Harrison had said, his voice cracking with emotion he couldn't control. I had no memory of that night. The medical records were classified, and my injuries. I never knew who had saved my life." Sarah's response had demonstrated the professionalism that had characterized her entire career. "Colonel Harrison, your recovery and continued service have been the greatest reward for any actions I took that night. Your success validates the decisions made under those circumstances." But Harrison's understanding of his debt to Sarah had extended beyond personal gratitude to professional respect that would reshape his entire approach to military leadership. He had just learned that his assumptions about others' capabilities could be not only wrong, but shamefully ignorant. The briefing had continued with Harrison's complete transformation from dismissive superior to grateful colleague who understood that Sarah's expertise in forward medical support was based on operational experience that exceeded his own combat service. Over the following days, as Harrison learned more about Sarah's career and the extent of her operational service, his respect had grown into advocacy for recognition that her sacrifice deserved but had never received due to classification requirements. Harrison's investigation into Sarah's service record had revealed that her actions in Afghanistan represented only one example of extraordinary courage that had characterized her entire career. Her willingness to risk her life for American personnel had been demonstrated repeatedly in situations where other medical officers couldn't or wouldn't operate. The classified nature of many of her operations had prevented public recognition of sacrifice that deserved the highest military honors. Her service record contained commendations and mission reports that documented courage under fire that had saved dozens of American lives. Harrison's growing understanding of Sarah's true contribution to American military operations had led him to become an advocate for declassification of records that would enable appropriate recognition of her service and sacrifice. His position on the Joint Task Force Planning Committee enabled him to influence medical support planning that could benefit from Sarah's unparalleled experience in forward trauma care. Her insights into medical evacuation under fire could save American lives in future operations. But perhaps more importantly, Harrison's experience had transformed his approach to evaluating personnel and understanding that extraordinary capability often conceals itself behind humble professional service. His lesson in judgment had changed how he assessed others throughout his career. The Joint Task Force Planning Committee's work had been enhanced immeasurably by Sarah's contribution, with medical support protocols that reflected her operational experience under conditions that most medical personnel would never encounter. Her recommendations for forward medical support had been incorporated into planning that would determine how American forces would provide trauma care in future conflict zones. Her expertise had enabled development of medical support systems that could save lives under the most demanding operational conditions. Years later, when operational security constraints allowed limited disclosure of Sarah's service record, Harrison had become her strongest advocate for recognition that her sacrifice deserved. His understanding of his debt to her courage had never diminished. Harrison's career had continued to flourish, with his promotion to general officer rank representing achievements that had been made possible by Sarah's sacrifice. His success had been built on the foundation of her courage, and his leadership had been informed by understanding of what true heroism looked like. But his most important contribution had been his advocacy for medical personnel whose courage under fire often went unrecognized because their primary mission was saving lives rather than taking them. His experience with Sarah had taught him that medical heroes deserved recognition equal to any warrior. The moment when Harrison had understood the source of Sarah's scars had lasted only minutes, but its impact on his character and career had continued for years. His transformation from ignorant superior to grateful advocate had demonstrated that true leadership required humility and recognition of others' contributions. Sarah's story had become an inspiration throughout the medical community, demonstrating that extraordinary courage often serves quietly until circumstances reveal the depth of sacrifice that has been made. For others, her scars had told a story of courage that words could never adequately convey, and Harrison's eventual understanding of that story had transformed his life and his approach to leadership in ways that honored her sacrifice. The conference room where Harrison had mocked her scars had become the place where he learned that true heroes often bear the marks of their courage silently, waiting for others to understand the stories written on their bodies by their willingness to sacrifice for others. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance, only to later discover that what you saw told a story of courage and sacrifice? Have you encountered people whose scars or differences concealed extraordinary service to others? Tell us in the comments about times when you learned that someone's appearance told a deeper story than you initially understood. And if you believe that heroes' scars are medals of honor that deserve recognition rather than judgment, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every story reminds us that the marks people bear often tell stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve our respect rather than our assumptions, and that true leadership requires understanding that heroism comes in many forms, including the quiet courage of those who risk everything to save others. We'll see you in the next story where we'll discover another incredible tale of hidden heroism revealed when it mattered most.